There we go. So just this webinar is being recorded. We just want to make the statement that if you do not consent to be recorded, or if you are not comfortable with that, we'll give everyone the opportunity to drop off at this time. If you wish to continue, just a moment, and we will keep going.
Welcome to enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Okay, well, welcome to our domestic violence prevention webinar that is scheduled today from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern.
Please re-enter your meeting
Sounds like
ID
somebody might be on. Just to remind you to mute yourself if you can as you join. There we go. So again, welcome, and we are so excited about the topic today as we look at domestic violence prevention, specifically from a cultural lens with cultural reconnection and cultural revitalization as a key protective factor. I was thinking about usually whenever I serve as moderators of webinars, I have the whole sport jacket and the tie. So I'm in a t-shirt today. That t-shirt says Choctaw on it. I know you can't see that right now, but my name is Nathan Billy. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I serve as the Director of Behavioral Health for the National Indian Health Board. And the reason I'm in my Choctaw shirt today is we and several of us from NHB have spent the morning on the steps of the Supreme Court, as close as we could possibly get in protection and defense of ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, as it is currently under threat. And as the Supreme Court heard arguments this morning, and I know many of you have been keeping up with that and have been checking all of your messaging across Indian country as those oral arguments have been presented this morning, and how perfectly connected to what we are talking about today. The protection of ICWA is directly related, of course, to keeping Native children.
Little thing.
We know that cultural connection through ICWA, keeping children, Native children within our tribal nations and connected to culture, is a key to lifelong positive health outcomes. We are healthier when we are connected to culture. And it's not just some of those specific outcomes that we think of generally in terms of suicide prevention and substance use disorder prevention, but today we focus specifically on what cultural connection, reconnection, what it means for domestic violence and intimate partner violence prevention for our services. And we're just grateful for all of you for joining us wherever you might have come from. Some of you have put in the chat the various roles that we serve. We're thankful for whatever role that is, from policy to programs to services. We all have a role to play in domestic violence prevention. So being able to focus on that today is absolutely something that you have asked for. And we responded with this opportunity in this webinar with some wonderful presentations today. So again, thank you so much for joining. Just as a quick housekeeping, of course, we do remind you to please stay on mute during the actual presentation. Our speakers have graciously agreed to Q&A time, so we are looking forward to a really good discussion, some really good questions and exploration together on how we can approach culture as prevention and as protective factors in domestic violence prevention. So let's begin with our first presentation, which is Brenda Hill. So welcome, Brenda. By means of introducing everyone to Brenda, Brenda is Siksika, and she has been the Director of Technical Assistance and Training for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center since January of 2019. She has been an advocate for ending violence against Native women and their children for over 30 years. Her work is based upon a grassroots, proactive, and culturally based perspective. Making connections and relationship building are central to her philosophy. She's noted that previously Brenda was an independent consultant following her position as Native Co-Director for the South Dakota Coalition Ending Domestic and Sexual Violence. Prior to that, she was the Education Coordinator for Sacred Circle, the National Resource Center to End Violence Against Native Women, for over 11 years. She is a founding mother and former director of the Women's Circle Shelter Program on the Lake Traverse Reservation, and was also faculty for the Sisseton-Wahpeton Community College, where she developed a chemical dependency degree program. Brenda earned a bachelor's degree from New York University and a master's and certificate in alcohol and drug studies from the University of South Dakota, but attributes her knowledge of advocacy to the women survivors who have honored her with their stories and their trust as an advocate, her experience as a survivor, and her relationships with grassroots advocates. So thank you again so much, Brenda, and please, the stage is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. I really appreciate this opportunity to share what I've learned. Grateful that you have all joined. You'll notice my email address is on the screen. If you have any questions, concerns, anything following the webinar, you want any kind of TA or training or whatever, please feel free to contact me. I also should mention that NIWRC's main office is in Lame Deer, Montana. However, most of us work remotely. And I come to you from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, real close to Minnesota. This is the land of Dakota people. Santi Dakota tribe is closest to us here, so I want to acknowledge that.
Think so. That's on.
If you could check your mute, please. So we have about an hour and a half to cover a lot of topics. So again, if you have questions or comments following this, you also feel free to put comments and questions in chat. And we'll make sure we have time to address those. If we run out of time, I still will get those comments and respond to you as directly and quickly as possible. Okay. So, speaking to you today during this amount of time that we have together about basically violence against women, as it says, domestic violence is not traditional. And in our work, our focus is on Indigenous women and their children, but that includes all of our relatives as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. I truly believe in my heart, our vision, our hope for recreating nonviolent, respect-centered relationships and communities is about reclamation of our traditional Indigenous belief systems and life ways. So we'll be talking about that. My style is usually to kind of give you the big picture and then move to more concrete things. So just to let you know, we will be moving to, well, all that theoretical and abstract stuff is wonderful, but what do I do today? We're in this situation. I'm hoping we spend, my plan is to allot time for that, those kinds of questions and concerns to be addressed. So I generally start out talking about history and culture. It's really important to know where we are today in terms of violence against, domestic violence within our communities, violence and against women in particular. How did we, what is our reality now? We have to be able to understand that, but also given our histories, regardless of what tribal nation you're from, if you look back before colonization, we didn't have domestic violence, any, in nothing remotely close to what we're experiencing today. We didn't need child protection programs, elder, abuse programs, those kinds of things, much less DV shelters. So that's also the hope. That's the vision for the future, I think, is, coming to understand how our culture created those kinds of societies. What has happened to us to land us where we are today, and how do we get back to that state again? Again, if someone could check if you're on mute, appreciate it. So I'm not going to read all the slides to you, but basically our culture reflects our thoughts, our beliefs, our understandings, how we create relationships, how we structure societies, how we interact with each other. And then, as I said, the history tells us both how our ancestors lived, what they went through, and how we ended up with today. Looking far enough back that, again, I believe it's the vision we have that we want to reclaim, re-indigenize. That's our protection, that's prevention, that's creating the social change we need in order to be safe. And be good relatives to one another. I usually, to explain the approach and to give away, to kind of analyze how we do our work, how to come up with, in quote, strategies. I love this story. Depending upon who you hear it from, I was told once that, oh, now my name, brain just went blank. Gloria Steinem told it. And then, as you know, we are as Native people, we take good things and then we Indianize them and make them even better. But I like to give credit where credit's due. So anyway, without reading the story to you, it's about three sisters who were out camping. One morning they went to get water. So they grabbed their buckets and whatnot. They're visiting. It's a wonderful day. As they move closer to the water, however, to the stream, they start hearing the cries of babies, like lots and lots and lots of babies, and that kind of cry that, you know, it's not hunger, it's fear, it's something bad's happening. So they rush to the river, and to their horror, they see all these babies just floating down the river, and so many are drowning. First sister jumps in, and as fast as she can, she's grabbing babies and throwing them on the shore. Second sister jumps in and saying, "You're not saving enough babies." She jumps in and she's teaching the babies to swim so they can save themselves. The third sister starts walking upstream. The two in the river are screaming at her, help us, you have to help us save the babies." And she says, I'm going up the river to see how the babies got in there in the first place. So when you think about what those sisters are doing, the first sister is the one in my work, is opening that shelter door, is answering the crisis line, is meeting a survivor, a relative in, ER, wherever. Literally doing things in that moment that's addressing the life-threatening crisis, saving lives. Now, the second sister, however, so I see her as the advocate, one of the major roles of advocates, and those of you that work in ER, depending upon your situation, your job responsibilities, you can probably relate to her. The second sister is actually putting the responsibility of victims and survivors to save themselves. I'm going to teach you how to swim. You save yourself, which in my mind is a little like, somebody gets run over, their leg is broken. Well, here's a crutch and the ER or the hospital's over there. Here, go save yourself kind of thing. Bandage yourself up and get over it. The third sister going upstream, well, let me put this, also add the first two sisters are in reaction. The bad thing has happened and they're reacting to it. And most of us can really relate to that. There's so much violence and crisis happening that we're just consumed with responding to things after the thing has already happened. The third sister is being proactive. She's trying to get to the root cause of why this is happening, how these babies got in the river in the first place. That's where it can truly be stopped and prevented, right? That's where the protection can occur to stop it. So, and in our work, our advocacy work, that's about social change. It can be about systems change, but most systems are also set up to react. So it's about social change. In Indian country, that's about re-indigenizing as much as we possibly can. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. So to think about those three roles and to kind of be clear, how are we doing as that first sister? How are we dealing with our relative who is that second sister that has great intentions, wants to do, save lives and whatever, but is kind of ill-informed, has misinformation. And then how do we, in our roles, regardless, how do we as relatives or title or anything else, how do we contribute to making social change to end the violence? Okay, so again, the next couple slides are about clarity about where we are today. All right, and I assume most of you have possibly seen these slides before. I'll also say, as bad as these stats are, my tendency is to believe that it's probably worse. Most advocates working out in the field in their communities figure, in their experience, it is a little bit worse than what we're getting out of these studies, but they still paint the picture. The horrific levels of violence that are happening in our communities, and this is gender-based. Violence against Indigenous women, all women really, is when we're talking intimate partner violence and rape, which is inclusive of all forms of sexual violence, the way I look at it, are women. Okay, does happen to men as well. The other thing that I'm going to try real hard not to read all my slides, kind of boring, but notice at the bottom where it's talking about at least 70% of the time, the perpetrators, the rapists, the batterer are non-native. Okay, if you're living and working on a reservation, that statistic is going to seem a little bit off in your experience. But remembering that about 70% of our people are unable to live on their homelands, they're not living in Indian country, then that stat seems a little more reality based. In terms of impact, then again, these stats are good because they provide both specifically stats for Indigenous women and men. But I would also do a comparison here. Although men are clearly survivors, that women are seemingly overrepresented in these stats also is really important information that we have. My understanding is most of you work in the healthcare field, so you'll note that the most common services needed are medical care. And over a third of female victims, and I think that stat is probably low, as well as for the men, 9% are they're not getting the medical care that they need. Okay, that's another whole discussion about IHS and funding and that kind of thing. That's part of the scenario as well, obviously. And that at least close to 40% of Indigenous women, about 17% of Indigenous men reported that they weren't getting the services needed. Okay, and that's really speaks to how our systems are structured as well. This slide is about, as I said, the vast majority of victims of intimate partner violence, battering, are women. Okay, about 3 to 5%. And you'll see variations on these, but overall they're about consistent. But the kind of caveat to that is we're not talking about unhealthy relationships. We're not talking about conflict. We're not even talking about just instances of violence that may be more related to substance abuse or whatever kinds of things. We're talking about battering / intimate partner violence, which is a system of behaviors. There's a pattern to it. It's purposeful. There's history to it. It's ongoing. So that's why some studies will have, vastly different statistics depending upon how they're defining what they're talking about. So, and that's another, I actually have a webinar that discusses that. To look at that clearly. I also want to make sure we're clear that we're also talking about relatives who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirit, that we're not just talking about cisgendered people, that this occurs in non-binary relatives as well. Okay, and that we need to make sure we're inclusive of them in all that we do. Okay, I'm going to take a little breath, but the picture is it's harsh, right? It's a harsh, ugly reality. The hope comes from the reality, part of reality that tells us that this does not have to happen. This is not human nature. Okay, This is something having to do with culture, okay, and belief systems, those kinds of things. Again, how do we know this? We just have to look at the histories of our own ancestors, our relatives, pre-colonization. That's where our hope is. Okay, that's where we get our direction from. It's really important. I've met women, maybe I'm speaking about you at some point in your life, or one of your relatives, or someone you're working with. I've worked with women who believed all men were violent. We're taught that if they're going to be a good woman, they need to be with a man. So they kind of put up with it. You know, they literally expected there to be violence, and kind of just hoped for a partner who was less violent. If we have that kind of belief, then we're not going to expect different. You know, we're not going to like try to change things because we think that's impossible. That's just the way it is. Our ancestors or relatives before us tell us that's not true. What we're seeing today is very unnatural. It doesn't have to happen. Also that, you know, if you have the opportunity, if you don't know or have already, to look at those histories and what the consequences were if it did happen. They were usually pretty immediate, very severe. Recidivism was not a thing back then, okay, for a reason. Okay, so how did we get to where we are today? What is the root cause of violence against Native women? Easy answer, complicated in some ways, but colonization, basically. When all the attempts at genocide failed, the different types of strategies and tactics to basically get rid of, in quotes, the Indian problem, were put into play. And so, but you see in this graphic, and Wayne Weston, he's Oglala Lakota, credit for developing this. This is actually top half of a handout. And I believe Nathan's putting the handouts in chat for you as well, because some of them that I'll be showing are really hard to read. Anyway, in the middle of this, you see that red circle. Represents the natural world, the sacred circle of life. The pressure that was brought to bear on that, you can go around these and, you know, chemical warfare, we're talking smallpox blankets, the purposeful use of alcohol, those kinds of things. We're talking about femicide, which is targeting specifically of women, Indigenous women, Nitsme Gleiss, that kind of thing. The dehumanization of Native people in general, you know, that whole the creatures thing that went out recently. That's dehumanizing, right? And demonizing, that's that, and you'll notice dehumanizing and demonizing specifically of Native women. Those are tactics that what that does is make us as human beings objects, spiritless, you know, objects. And you can do whatever you want to an object. There's total breaking of relationships there. It makes, that's the permission giver for violence. You know, in the reservation systems, I think you're all aware of, you know, the result that we're still living with boarding and mission schools. The isolation is so powerful. It's a part of a technique when you're looking at MIWs, or I'm sorry, POWs, brainwashing techniques. If you looked at those, there's a huge connection between these tactics of oppression and what they do to prisoners of war and brainwashing. Very similar. So you can go around and look at those, all those different tactics, and think about the impact it has. The pressure it brought to bear on our worlds, it was implosive. You know, all the destruction that caused for individuals, for extended families, for us as peoples. The other thing to keep in mind is when we look at the tactics of battering, intimate partner violence, these tactics of oppression are replicated in, same kinds of things on a different level within the system of tactics of battering, intimate partner violence, as well as other forms of oppression. So, and then we have pictures. And if you need to take a break, if you need to step away, because this is hard to listen to when we recall these things, take care of yourself, okay? Do what you need to do for yourself. So I'm trying to go through these quickly. Some of you may be familiar with that, kill the Indian, save the man quote. We use these pictures a lot. I used them back in Sacred Circle. So for over 20 some odd years, we use these these pictures, kind of the before and after in boarding schools. And finally, it always bothered me when I looked at those pictures that there weren't any names. That's kind of objectifying all in itself. And someone who wasn't able to find out the name of the person who did it, but did the research. So this is Tom Torlino, Navajo, Dene. Okay, that's his name, the before and after. And again, these are you see these pictures a lot. These are the names of those, our relatives that these pictures are about. Okay. So as a result of all the pressure, those tactics on that sacred world, that sacred circle of life, it kind of imploded, that oppression, all those different tactics of colonization part of it was about changing our belief systems, the way our world is structured. And that's represented by that triangle. It's called a hierarchy. It's unnatural. There is no shape in nature that is a flat triangle. It doesn't happen, okay? And then you see all the different forms of violence and, that we're dealing with today, right? Everything from identity confusion to all the different forms of violence, male privilege and dominance, incest, all of that, including, loss of our culture, or spiritual and cultural confusion, those kinds of things. So that's probably the briefest, shortest way to talk about how we got to where we are to today. But I need to say that even when I think about when I first arrived on the Assistant Wahpeton Reservation, alcoholism was high. It's still high, but I remember walking into council meeting and councilmen being drunk. I remember the boarding school, and today people that our peoples have made a lot of progress, I guess you could say, have healed a lot. The boarding school is closed. It's been demolished. The land was given back to the tribe, and now it's more of a park and a healing place, so things are changing. It's kind of like when I think back to, because I've been doing the work for 33 years in that neighborhood. I could only dream of having this amount of people together concerned, to talk about it, trying to figure out how they can impact it and make change. Violence Against Women Act, as harsh as it is, we're still making change, positive change. And along with that, it's no pure coincidence that as tribes are able to get themselves safe, as tribal nations, as we're able to gather resources and do that, we're able to reclaim our cultures, our ceremonies, our languages, our life ways. You see changes everywhere within that community. Those things are all connected. So again, trying to move through these. a little bit quickly so we can get to the other positive side of this as well. So you have all this oppression, you know, as I explained in those two graphics. And the bottom half was all about internalized oppression. And that's when we become brainwashed. You know, boarding schools, how we're socialized, the educational system, present their culture as a reality. And it's a harsh one. It's very unnatural. So we end up being socialized and kind of brainwashed ourselves, and the oppression becomes internalized. We come to believe and act like our oppressors. We believe what they tell us about what is reality, you know, and what isn't, those kinds of things. You know, the isolation, the boarding schools, all of that contributes to set up a perfect scenario for the violence, for addictions, all of that. But I always say, you know, we also talk about ourselves as being very resilient as Indigenous people, and our ancestors are with us and they're helping us move forward past this. But part of that is understanding these kinds of dynamics. Internalized oppression divides us. It's just as every tactic is about breaking relationships. Internalized oppression then is about breaking relationships too. And we all experience it's a process to become aware of it and how to overcome it, and reclaim the values and life ways of our ancestors. So, but you'll see internalized oppression everywhere you go, right? As Indigenous people, sometimes we're ashamed of our own culture. You know, the drunkenness, all the different kinds of addictions, disrespect for God, modeling behaviors of the cavalry in some ways within our own communities, all that competitiveness, gossiping, all the negativity. It's a combination of the impact of oppression directly, but it's also about when we internalize things. We were, again, all that violence, all the poverty, all the isolation that was imposed upon us. The way we are today is just actually a logical consequence of that. It's, you know, you get hit, you expect to be bruised. And you don't shame yourself for that bruise, but you try to get safe and put yourself in a place and gather things you need in order to heal. And that's where we're at, I think, today. And then as a result of internalized oppression, you know, it's directly related to lateral violence. And that's where we aim it at each other. People within our own group, people within our own families, communities, you know, it's that Indian against Indian kind of thing. Sometimes women against women, men against men, within our communities as well. Again, direct result, logical consequence of oppression. So how did that happen? How did that happen? Again, it's about belief system. And if you remember, we started with that sacred circle, and then as a result of oppression, it became internalized. And the triangle represents this unnatural belief system. Okay, if we had a lot more time, I could go way into detail, but the important thing is to think about, you know, that sacred circle tells us, represents interconnectedness, that we're all interdependent and we're all related to each other, right? What happens to one is, you know, if I treat someone a certain way and it's bad, it's going to go around that circle. Many of you probably have that same belief, that it picks up speed and sooner or later it's going to come back and hurt you as well. We affect each other in all kinds of ways because we're so related. And this unnatural belief system, if you see those lines, those are about breaking of relationships. You could do one on like reality. And in this system, it would be God, men, women, and children. And I used to talk about, and then be animals, and then be plants. And then I thought, no, in this system, they don't believe animals and plants have spirit. So those are just objects. So they wouldn't even be included in here. So this represents lack of spirituality to a very large extent, and it shows disconnection. It shows destruction of relationships. It really represents objectification in a lot of ways. So you can look at any institution, organization, system in America, we expect a hierarchy, right? That's where you get the chain of command, who's in charge, who's on top, those kinds of expressions. I know one organization tried to work more as a collective, as in a circle, and they would just frustrate people. Someone would call in and say, I need to talk to whoever's in charge. And they'd be like, well, what is it you need? Well, I need to talk to who's ever in charge. Well, if you tell me what you need, I can tell you who can help you. And they just have this struggle, you know, getting people to understand we're trying to get needs met here. It's not about who's in charge. But the thing about this is whoever's on top in the hierarchy, that's the seat of power and control. That's who's entitled, who has privilege, all of that over others. They have power and control over those below. Okay, to understand this is about power and control. Who has it and who doesn't. So maybe some of you have played King of the Hill or at least know how to play it. I was raised in a family of all girls. It's no coincidence that at times we played King of the Hill. We didn't play Queen of the Hill, but King of the Hill. Again, I'm trying to save some of, it's about male-dominated patriarchal hierarchy. But if you remember how you play that game, the point is to be on top above everybody else. And you had to be violent, right? Kick, punch, pull, push, trip, whatever you need to do. Those are required. You had to be competitive. You had to be okay with valuing violence. It was something positive. It was about winning and being above and winning as an individual, not as a group. Okay. It also defined masculinity in very violent ways. Okay. Which, you know, if you define masculinity and power as in terms of violence, and then you raise boys to be masculine in those kinds of ways, those unnatural ways, you get what we've got. Okay. Always say, think Indian, you know, who are the powerful people in our communities, you know, traditionally pre-colonization, and people usually say, well, women and healers, you know, sometimes children. Well, why is that? Well, because they could give life, nurture life, protect life. It was about nurturing. It was about life giving, rather the opposite of that. And on here, you'll notice too, it's about breaking relationships. You can't do that kind of violence without breaking relationships. So I think I kind of just said that. I'm trying to monitor my time a little bit. I'm going to stop for a second. Do we have anything in chat?
We don't have any questions that have been added just a moment, but would you like to pause a moment to see if anyone has any immediate questions or?
I could.
Okay.
Or comments.
So if you have questions or comments, you're more than welcome to post them in the chat. And Brenda, if you're comfortable with that, we can also ask if anyone wants to raise their hand. We can have you take yourself off mute and ask yourself the question yourself. We would love to hear your voice.
Okay.
Also, one thing I do like to offer as well, especially when we're talking about very specific topics, if there's a question that you would like to ask, but you would rather ask it anonymously, you're more than welcome to direct message me, Nathan Billy, in the chat, and I can ask your question on your behalf if you're more comfortable with me doing that.
Got to say, that's brilliant. I've never heard anybody say that before, but I'm going to steal that practice from you. Thank you, Nathan. Anybody? Okay. All right, then I'll keep going. Another way to understand the impact of colonization and the comparison of where we were and what we're trying to When we talk about re-indigenizing, what that's about. The natural world is character-based, right? Who you are, what kind of relative you are, whether you can be trusted, who you are as a human being and as a relative, I think kind of sums that up. And you'll notice that those of you, and not all tribes use teepees, but you're familiar with them. Have you ever put one up or seen one put up? The base of it needs to be as perfect as a circle as possible. They can withstand all kinds of weather and storms and winds and whatever, if the base is round, perfectly round. And actually, if you've seen the equality wheel, or we call it now the respect wheel, if you turn this teepee on its side and looked at the bottom, that could represent that wheel, that equality wheel, respect wheel, okay? Versus this flat belief system, unnatural belief system, where your gender, your race, actually even the literal color of your skin, your economic class, sexual orientation and identity, all of those things that are, labels, basically, that don't tell you anybody who you really are as a human being. Those are the things that determine in the hierarchy how you're valued. Okay, so kind of food for thought there. And this is a real terrible slide in terms of graphics, but it's a handout that's available to you. And this is just another way to think about that, the root cause. That story inspired in me this graphic, basically. So you see on one side, violence on natural life way, on the other, nonviolence, the natural life way. Trees grow from the roots up. So that's how it's intended for people to read this. It's about our belief system. Okay. And based on those beliefs, then you develop supports for those. So I'm going to focus more on the nonviolent side, where as Indigenous people, we know that all things in creation have spirits, and they're all related. We know that respect is the foundation of relationships. We know that people are spirits in human form here to learn. And we have individual, unique spiritual paths that are simply our own and are respected. That women are sacred, as well as children and all other forms of life. And that we're all interconnected. Then you add to that what supports or brings to life those beliefs are our practices, the way we are, how we build community, build relationships. Prayer and ceremony are integral to that. Honoring the gifts in others. There's a belief, right, that everybody is born for a reason, has a role and a purpose. We may never understand that other person's role and purpose, but we honor it and support it and respect it and know that it impacts us in a good way if they're able to live that. We had so many ways of practicing nonviolence and respect. Mental self-discipline, seeking advice from women and elders, those kinds of things. And as a result, then in the branches, you see these communities of and relationships, and that the branches show all the different qualities, principles, and values as well in that. So that's what we're aiming for in reclaiming our ways. So I think I put this, I had a hard time figuring out where to put this slide in the PowerPoint, but this is the hierarchy, the triangle that represents all the tactics of battering. And again, it's available in the handout, and we have posters and brochures on this if you're not already familiar with it. In order to end the violence, we have to know how it works, and this really tells you how to do it. Notice the base of it is it's about unnatural power and control. And the outside structure is physical and sexual violence. Okay. And in the middle are all the different tactics that occur to victims, survivors of intimate partner violence or battering. Very often simultaneously, continuously, and we need to understand how they operate. They're in no particular order. Because we live in a hierarchy, it's like we try to read from the top, and like I said, then as you go further down, we figure that's less important. That's not true in this graphic, except for, in this case, male privilege as key to violence against women in intimate partner violence. Male privilege, if you're a male or you're having trouble understanding what that's about, if this is a triangle representing racism, then we understand white privilege and how to that person who's white, that may be really hard to grasp and understand their privilege, their entitlement, that kind of thing, because it's kind of invisible at times, but it operates exactly the same way. It plays out a little bit differently, but it operates in the same way. It's the big permission giver for all the other forms of abuse that occur through all these other tactics. If you're working with survivors, and if you're alive in America, you are regularly, then my hope is, if you're not already familiar, you get real familiar with how these tactics operate. They operate, you'll see it, whether it's very clear or not is another issue. You'll see it in healthcare settings, the results of it. The people that are called non-compliant might be their batters not letting them take their meds or show up at appointments, those kinds of things. Okay, so the opposite of that, I'm trying to monitor my time here too, is the natural belief system. And if we had way more time, I'd ask you what this represents to you, and within your tribe, how is that? How does that look? But it's always positive, right? It's about interconnection, interdependence. It's about equality and equity, all of those things. If those are our basic values, and we're really clear on how we bring those to life in what we do, you have a nonviolent society where everybody is nurtured and protected. So if someone told me that, okay, Brenda, you can have PowerPoint, but you can only have one slide, this would be it. It's about relationships. It's always about relationships, either the breaking of relationships, the maintaining or nurturing, or the creating of relationships. Okay. And that's true whether you're talking climate change or politics, or, the things we're addressing today a little more directly. So when I'm having difficulty understanding something, or I'm just having a bad day, I have to think about, okay, so where are my relationships at with maybe my coworkers, or maybe my grandkids or kids or friends, whoever, where are my relationships at? Do I really need to reconnect? To think about that it's kind of a good meditation place as well. And the other thing that I struggle with routinely, those of you that are advocates, I'm sure can also relate to this, is trying to deal with the whole issue of accountability, because very often we're focused on victims and survivors, and that's appropriate, that's necessary. But part of my brain is like, but if we held offenders, abusers, batterers, rapists accountable, maybe maybe this person, this woman, these children, whoever it is, this relative would be safe, So it's about offender accountability, but it's also a place to do self-reflection. Am I holding myself accountable as a relative? How do I hold myself accountable in my work? Am I accountable? Who am I accountable to? To the system or to my relatives? So it's like a process. It's difficult. It's kind of like lifelong. We need each other in that process. So, and just side note, in January, I'll be doing a webinar on accountability. So it'll be on our website if you want a little more discussion and thought about that. Okay, so again, trying to move towards the positive. What can we do in our lives, in our work, to provide protection and build prevention against these forms of violence? So a few years back, I found this resource, that this program that actually has policies on, instead of lateral violence. You know how often we do anti stuff? You could do like anti-lateral violence work, or in this case, what they talk about is lateral kindness. How do we structure lateral kindness? So this first slide I included, it's like prepare yourself, kind of like ceremony. If you participate in ceremonies, you've probably been told preparation is everything. It's like I was told, by the time you get to ceremony, if you're preparing in a mindful way, in a good way, they already know. The spirits already know by the time you get there. So preparation for our work is about gathering our courage, our goodwill, and our determination as well. Okay. And that we need each other in that. So I want to include this in here because I thought it was brilliant. It's kind of uplifting and something you could, discuss and choose to adapt in some way, possibly. Okay, so it's about, as it says, it's about holding each other up. Instead of focusing on negative behaviors and issues, lateral kindness celebrates positive behaviors in others, even small ones. It's a system in which individuals are uplifted and supported. Just reading that, there's positive energy in those words. I would say not only positive behaviors in others, but in yourselves, ourselves. And so this one is the actual policy. Again, credit to First Nations Health Authority up in Nova Scotia, Karen Fish and Jamie Steph. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And I'm sure they'd be glad to answer questions if you had more about this or wanted to adopt something like that. Words are powerful, so that's why I think even in our policies, to have that concept is just awesome. And again, hopefully you won't get too sick of me saying it. It's about relationships. But I tell you what, if you're in a crisis or something, you might hear that voice and think about this, and hopefully it'll help support you get through that. Okay, so you can have policy and procedure. How many of you have policy and procedures, and the only time you pull that book out or pull up that file is when a crisis hits, right? Something bad happens. And do we have that holiday off or not? But those kinds of questions. But basically, again, it's about how do we, hopefully our policies and procedures reflect our vision and mission as an organization, regardless of what organization you are. But the next step then is, are we able to live that within our organizations? And sometimes that's where the conflict occurs. But knowing that conflict is also an opportunity for growth and learning and recreating relationships too. I want to include these slides. Yes, they are about relationships. These quotes take it a step further, and I know, everything's connected when you're talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence. At some point, you end up talking about mental health issues. You talk about suicide. We talk about trauma. We talk about substance abuse, if I didn't already say that. Okay, in each one of those fields, they all come to the same place at some point. That first quote, there's no more effective neurobiological intervention than a safe relationship. by Bruce Perry. So you can Google Bruce Perry's work. And he works in trauma, I believe, and also in substance abuse field. So to know that our relationships, being able to connect is just life. You know, we know with babies that if you can feed them, clothe them, keep them warm, do everything for them, but if you don't touch them, hold them, connect with them, then you have failure to thrive, and babies can die from that, right? I'm not so sure. I think that what this is saying is that we don't outgrow that. We maybe grow strong enough to kind of withstand that kind of thing to an extent, but it's going to harm us and hurt us. We have that need. And then the next quote, Professor Peter Cohen, and there's the citation on the bottom if you want to look further into it. But this is about people that are isolated, don't have relationships, end up bonding with having relationships with whether it's gambling, alcohol, whatever kind of drug, shopping, food. We call them addictions. Here he's saying more appropriate to call it bonding. Okay, and at the bottom, powerful, right? So the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is human connection. So for advocates, for all of us, I think that's real powerful. A lot of times we try to fix things, we kind of want to come up with recipes and resources to help people fix their situation, to heal or whatever. And to remember, you know, within our cultures, the reality is that it's about our connection to each other, connecting to other human beings. So to not, what I'm trying to do is validate that. You know, if all of us have been through crises, probably numerous ones, if we think back at what helped us make it through that, very often, most often, I think we identify one person, maybe two if we're really blessed, that just sat with us, recognized us, saw us, that made us feel seen, you know, gave us what we needed to be able to keep moving, that's what moved us through that difficult time. So I'm going to take a stop now for a minute. Anybody, any comments or questions? Anything you'd like to add? I know this, I'm talking kind of fast and it's a lot to process.
I really the opportunity to share and have dialogue. Hi, my name is Allison, and I just missed the slide about policies, writing policies, and I'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind going back. I think it's just 10 slides, if that's not too much trouble. Even though that's, you know, I feel like it was after your complex slide about your tree model. And I would just like to say that I really appreciate your tree model, because I don't think that solutions or explanations are as simple as we tend to make them from the Western science perspective. And, you know, the Indigenous lens is tremendously complex. We have a lot of capacity to hold, you know, complex intergenerational concepts in mind and in heart simultaneously. So I really appreciate you walking us through that. I think it was just before this. And thank you so much for your willingness to be present, to do the work, and also to give us so many helpful resources and to give us the space to process this. So thank you very much.
Welcome. Is this the slide you were talking about?
Yeah, really appreciate it.
I think, Nathan, are you giving out the PowerPoint as well, or?
Yes, Brenda, would you like me to share the entire PowerPoint in the chat?
Sure, if you'd like to, or
Yeah.
people can email me.
Okay, sure.
I can send it directly.
I can drop it here too.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so Indigenous culture and spirituality. Gee, even I'm like, again, Brenda? You know, there is something to repetition. Maybe I overdid it. Sorry. Anyway, but from there are a few things on this slide though. We do not heal alone. Part of prevention and protection and all of those things is and comes from assimilation, the unnatural belief system that strong, smart, credible, trustworthy people, especially men, do things alone, that we should heal alone. You know, we train boys to that, you know, be that independent. I always think of the Marlboro Man out on the horse, way out there on, you know, in the mountains or something. He's totally isolated. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Men alone, single men are kind of promoted everywhere, in the movies, wherever, as being isolated, totally independent. Well, that's so unnatural, you know, and I've known women that, you know, well, gonna go get a protection order. Okay, I can go this time or whatever. No, I can do it myself, Brenda. I can do it myself. So I know you can do it yourself, but you shouldn't have to do it yourself. There's safety in numbers, and you just, no woman, no person should have to stand alone. We do this together. And that's also true of healing. So I remember when I was working at Sacred Circle, there's one woman, she's a little older than me, spoke Lakota. She was an elder, seen as an elder, and she hardly ever raised her voice, but I heard her one day just loud, talk about a wake-up call. She said, "Who do you think you are? What do you think you're doing? You are a Lakota man, and you know you do not heal alone." You know, she just was like getting through to him, I think. But it's like there's a reason for everything, that I probably needed to hear that as well. That we do nothing alone. Even, you know, Vision Quest from Bletcha. You're never alone. You're never alone. Recognize that. It's like, you know, you call on your ancestors, you call on your relatives. We need each other. That it's not a weakness, that it's kind of silly, counterproductive, and possibly lethal to kind of try to walk through life on your own, or to see that as a wonderful thing. It really is like, how do we nurture and prop people up, acknowledge if you're really a good friend, you really know how to make good relationships, you're really supportive, you're really, you know, you have a gift for interconnecting and whatever it is. That's trauma informed, that's human informed, that's our culture, that's our spirituality. Practicing the values, bringing those to life. Privacy, you know, I really wish we had a lot more time to get into a lot of these things, but especially the way we're trained to be service providers. And that as women, I think we're very often pushed to find out what's wrong and fix it, you know. Think of that mindset versus, you know, when we're in ceremony, if we're around that, how we look at those situations. That people needing to share everything. When we have to have laws around confidentiality rather than just respect. Respecting people's privacy, whatever, to think about those situations. The other thing in terms of reclaiming our cultures is, I think, language. Now, because I live in Lakota and Dakota country, have for like 40 years, something like that, whatever it is, I know more Lakota and Dakota words than my own. But I still know that I don't think, and I started asking people that spoke their own languages, is there a word in your language for client? Is there a word in your language for patient, for director? You know, all those things. And of course, you kind of know what the answers were. And I've had discussions with some really awesome advocates doing great work that they call themselves case managers, call the people that are working with clients. And from their life experience and education, they saw that as a way of signaling that they're a professional to use those titles. You know, and these things are all process, right? Help each other through. I've had conversations with them. Well, if what we're trying to do is, you know, re-indigenize, bring our culture to every aspect of our lives, including our work, including our organizations, then maybe we can reconsider how we call each other. It really matters, okay? Because the hierarchy and our training in Western educational systems and in medicine train us to use labels and titles and those kinds of things. Those are really ways of breaking a relationship, right? They train us. I have a master's in counseling, you're supposed to keep a distance, supposed to be objective, which I think is kind of delusional. There's a difference between being objective and understanding that we're related. And in this moment, my relative needs everything I've got, everything I can bring, that they're the most important right now. They're the priority, their situation. That's my role here as a relative, is to, you know, to help them, support them, do whatever. The model I use in doing my work, and when I was working, you know, more closely with advocates, you know, I'd get questions, calls about, well, this one woman in shelter is doing this, and this other woman, and you know, and she wants that, and or just all kinds of questions. And I don't always have the answer or the recipe, but I go to my bubble, you know, and think about literally, how do I believe my relatives would have handled that similar situation a long time ago, before colonization? And like 99% of the time, it gives me my answer. Okay. To think about those impacts. You know, one time I asked somebody during a training or counselor training, why do we have titles? One guy got a very pained look on his face. He's thinking really hard, and he said, well, if we didn't have titles, then how would we know who's doing what or who's who? You know, which is really telling. He's being honest and sincere. And I think that's probably the reality, you know, a lot of times. It should be in how we act, right? How we are, that we know the answers to those questions. The other is to prioritize safety in everything we do. In everything we do, according to that person who is unsafe. And on every level, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, economically, all of that. You know, housing. If you're houseless, then you're in danger. We know that poverty, you know, makes us targets for a lot of things. So again, I wanted to uplift, you know, since being trauma informed for the last, I don't know, how long has it been, 15, 20 years now? It's like a thing, it's required, it's good. How we interpret that is, you know, in practice, sometimes there are issues and it can be difficult. But the more I thought about that, it's like, well, you know, as an advocate, I think we were doing that, you know, but if I'm thinking, if I call it a thinking Indian, if I'm thinking Indian, what being trauma informed calls us to do really is utilizing the values and practices of our traditions. Okay, healing as a collective, right? Healing together. It provides a sense of identity and belonging, right? So if, you know, I covered up the top and I just gave you the list of these things, for the most part, you'd probably identify these are cultural things, you know, principles of our cultures. But if you were focusing just on trauma, what we call trauma responses, these also would be true. Okay, so to think about that and bring those those gifts and understandings again to work to our jobs, because it's a longer conversation, but I think ideally we shouldn't have to shift. We can change our hats when we get to work, and then we take it off and put on a different one when we're home or in a different situation, but we shouldn't be changing our belief system. So if your values at home are a certain way, then how do we bring those to work? Because that's not, if we're changing our values and our beliefs when we're at work, that's not changing hats. Okay, so, you know, and I realized that. We'll talk about going through changes when I first graduated and was on the job, and the day that it occurred to me, okay, Brenda, you thought you were being bicultural, but you're not. This is closer to like something a little more, you know, schizophrenic or multiple personality. You cannot switch your basic beliefs from one to the other, you know, where I was in particular thinking about how I was taught to, you know, talk, people, get people to talk, get them to share the story over and over and over again. Well, that didn't happen in ceremony. They would like caution you, you know, don't be going there. See yourself as healed and whatever, and not to be in denial either, but to understand the impact of those words. So it was really, there are a lot of things I had to relearn and unlearn. Let's see, I'm running out of time. What slide am I on? Okay. Hopefully, this is the downside of doing things virtually. I could be looking at body language and asking questions and raising hands. Hopefully you have background in trauma, what it means to be trauma informed. If you're not, I have some good resources here, but the best is the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. They're awesome. Okay. And do have resources. They have just a plethora of resources, and many specifically for people within healthcare, the healthcare field as well. So, and then Russell Strand, he actually works more with law enforcement, but I found his stuff real helpful for working, training advocates and understanding things myself. But I just love that quote, being trauma informed is more than being nice. To be nice is to be human. And he basically calls for us to make sure we understand the neuroscience of trauma. And I'll let you read through this list, but that's real important to me. In my experience, there are a lot of organizations and people at that National Center I mentioned are also perplexed, shall we say. A lot of people are using that language, trauma informed. But then they like have policies that, well, you know, shelter, you have 30 days, you know, or, okay, we're trauma informed, but here's these 20 pages of forms that you need to complete now, you know, or here's your appointment, you know, if you miss your appointment, well, then you can't have another one until next month. You know, those kinds of practices, not trauma informed, not particularly nice either, right? If you understand the neuroscience of trauma, you know there is an organic, neurological, you know, physical changes that happen in your brain, and willpower will not impact that. Making a good decision will not impact that. It is what it is. There needs to be healing, and it takes a lot of time. And that's kind of a real brief summary of, you know, of that. We're asking people very often who have been traumatized to do what is literally impossible for them, and then they get re-victimized, they get blamed, whatever. They're not believed in court. Well, she changed the story. Well, yeah, she changed the story because the part of her brain shut down during whatever event she's barely survived, so that she could survive. Those memories either are no longer there, or they might be accessible down the road. Who knows? Sometimes memories pop up. Sometimes they're not there to pop up to begin with. Those kinds of things. So I better get off that soapbox. Okay. Then also to let you know, if you're not already aware, SAMHSA has resources on trauma-informed approaches. So again, safety is number one. I love that. I think that should always be. Safety is the number one thing. If people are not safe, it's unrealistic and it's beyond victim blaming. It's actually harmful to set up someone to make any kind of change if they're not truly safe. It's not like a good mental health practice to have that kind of expectation. That's why people will stop asking for help, because they ask and their situation is, they're not treated in a good way, a realistic way for what they've gone through and how they've been affected. So I notice culture, history, and gender issues are also part of being trauma informed. And those are all things that we need to consider also from the cultural lens. So again, from the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, you can see in the bottom the acronym. We want to normalize human responses to trauma, support healing, minimize re-victimization. Now, if you thought of that, think of this from a cultural lens, from what we've been taught about being Indigenous, Native. We have another way of saying that. That's just normal, in quotes, to our practices, right? Being non-judgmental. Knowing that we cannot ever understand another person because they have their own unique experience and path in life. So we don't try to force people to explain themselves, you know, or the reactions they're having to things. Really key in this approach is, you know, it's how many times have we all thought about ourselves or someone else, what's wrong with them? They keep doing this thing, or they're acting some kind of way. And shifting that question to what happened to you, that understanding that what you're seeing is the logical impact of what they've survived. And then seeing symptoms, what we might see as illogical behaviors or resistance, all that other language. What you're really seeing is what someone has used to survive. That's how they've made it to you, that they use these coping skills or whatever to be able to make it through the day. And honoring people's voices and experiences. It's really important. And again, I think that's part of our cultures. Okay, I'm always running out of time, no matter how many times I go through my PowerPoints and try to cut things. This slide was created for advocacy training, actually. And if you go down this list, same thing. I think you can look at that. It was created from the lens of being trauma informed, but it's also our challenge, I think, to reinterpret these a little bit as these are culturally based principles and understanding. Okay, to be inclusive, you know, I talked about the neurobiology of trauma, violence, relationships, being trustworthy. It's about acting with character, right? It's part of our culture. So rather, why don't they trust me? It's like I need to be asking myself, am I trustworthy? What am I doing to show that I am trustworthy? So I don't know about you, when someone says, oh, you can trust me, I automatically don't trust them. You know, it's like, if you have to advertise that, how come? But also, sense of humor is on one of our lists. That's one of our cultural things. Respect for privacy, not just confidentiality and HIPAA and all that, but human to human, going through things. When people share their stories, really feeling honored that they shared that story. Because that's the way I feel when a woman, a survivor, talks to me and shares their story. It's like, I want to always stay mindful that she's been through unholy hell. She's been betrayed numerous times by probably dozens of people. And it is an act of courage and a blessing to me when that person shares their story with me. Am I going to respect that and keep it private as well? Okay. So you can go through that. The whole of screen people in, not out. When we have one of the toughest practices to deal with is programs where shelter programs, and I think this happens in medical facilities too. You show up drunk or high, you're out. You're not let in very often. And what trauma-informed practices in our cultural ways say is recognize your relative is really vulnerable, really hurting, really in an unsafe, bad place. How can we help them? Okay, how can we help them? Not just keep pushing them away, because remember, isolation, breaking of relationships, it's key in everything, in violence, or certainly when we're talking addictions, we're talking suicide. Okay, all those things are related around that. And the other is allow for time, which the systems were challenged on that, right? There's not enough time. We're taught, 50-minute hours or 20-minute sessions or whatever it is, rather than recognizing that that's not the reality if we're really trying to support people's healing. Okay, I'm going to try not to go too much into overtime. Sorry, Nathan, but I'm going there, I guess. We talk about intergenerational trauma in a lot of settings, right? That it's in our DNA, and that most of us have become aware that we don't talk about it quite as much, I think, is that resilience is also in our DNA. Okay. And how do we, if these are the strengths as a people, these practices, our oral history, storytelling, ceremony connection, all that, if those are what help us survive and thrive as Indigenous people within our tribal nations, then how do we bring that into our individual lives, our family lives? How do we bring that into our work so it's consistent all the way through? How do we?
I'm the best.
Is that a question? Couldn't understand, couldn't hear. Is that a question or comment? Or just somebody muted?
I think that was just an unmute thing.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay. And let's see, I'll let you read that list real quickly. But again, to look at what aspects of our culture that we focus on, particularly when we're talking about re-indigenizing or resilience. How do we bring those practices, those ways, those customs to everything we do in our work? And this slide maybe is one I should have said, okay, cut it, Brenda, but this is about figuring out how to recenter who's making the decisions, who are the leaders. If you're, those two things, that's about power and control as well, right? And then again, I'm not going to read this to you, but hopefully you will read it. But the thought behind the slide was that in my work, when I first started, being an advocate was another way of saying I've been battered or I've been raped or both. And because of that, that's why I'm doing the work. That experience with the experience of other women that shared that similar experience is literally why we are here today talking about this, that we had the expertise. And sometimes, and it's acknowledgement that if you survived it, if you lived it, if you overcame it, all of that, you have expertise and then the right to make decisions that impact your life. That's true of us as sovereign nations, right? As tribal nations, it's a sovereignty issue, basically. So how do we in our organizations, and depending upon where you're working, I know this can be way difficult and maybe impossible in your lifetime, but in the ideal world, that the people impacted by that decision are the decision makers. It's kind of like how would like SNAP, if SNAP was run by people, the main qualification was you had to survive on SNAP for 2 years of your life in order to get that job to make those decisions. How would that system transform? You know, and play that out in every organization. So that's what this is about. And also validating, you know, and uplifting the knowledge that we had clans and societies, all different kinds for good reasons. That's where prevention and protection came from. And so how can we, if at all possible, bring that to our work as well? And I think I said this a bazillion times. All right, again, safety, safety, safety. Using how our ancestors lived, how we treated each other, all those basic principles. You know, I always think about, especially in shelter, well, how come people have survivors that, you know, women and children beaten up, whatever, and they're there to get safe, and you want them to sign out sheets and blankets. And one place I went, they had to ask for the toilet paper. You know, other places, all the paperwork and justifications and whatever. And I think, man, you know, not that long ago, and certainly not in my home, if you have a visitor, especially one who's been so harmed, you feed automatically, right? You make people, your visitors, comfortable. You would, you know, traditionally, I think most people's had practices like you were taught to be mindful and pay attention and never ever put someone in a position where they have to ask for something they need, you know, and to give in like a humble way where it doesn't embarrass. You know, if those are our principles, how do we bring that to every part of our work? So this talks about some of the exercises or principles. Let's see. I'm just going to move through that. Okay, and this is a list of things that are easily identified as cultural practices I think we can bring to our work. Sharing food, even if it's, you know, water is medicine. Can we provide that routinely? You know, keeping our sense of humor, right? Somehow that's a lot of days, that's how we maintain our sanity, right? Seeing the medicine in all of these things, you know, for ourselves and as well as the people we're working with. So, and then this is a quote from an advocate. I'm trying to remember her tribe. I think she's Anishinaabe. And I'll let you read that. Well, maybe I should read it. Being part of our interconnectedness is that we don't lose ourselves. Many identify themselves first by their job title, but first and foremost, we are human and spiritual beings with hearts and compassion to help those who are hurt, and that we need each other to help and support one another. So we carry the heaviness of what we do together so we don't burn out and lose sight of who we are. So it just gives me chills every time I read that. So another one of my favorite graphics in the world. Always defend your right to heal at your own pace. You are taking your time. You are allowed to take your time. And there's a way to say that. It's, you know, that's part of being Indigenous, I think, that understanding. And again, how do we create that expectation rather than, you know, we have to meet the expectations of that program or that institution. And even if you can't change, you know, you're the worker, so to speak, you don't have the power and control to change whatever, having that understanding and saying, I'm sorry, you know, I need you to do this. It's, you know, I wish I could give you more time, but so that it's not, you know, the person understands, you get it. And you're sending a message that it's not their fault. They're not asking for too much. They're not weak or so damaged, you know, because they need more time or they need whatever. That it's really their right to ask for or to be able to do things in a certain way in a certain amount of time. That means a lot to people when you can show that kind of empathy connection. Okay, so I'm just putting this up there and trying to, shall we take like 5 minutes before break? Is that okay, Nathan? Is
Sure, that
there
would be
any
fine.
comments
That'd be
or-
great to see if we have any comments. And again, just a reminder, you're welcome to pop your comments into the chat, or you can remove yourself from mute and ask the comment out loud. Or I can also ask your confidential questions if you want to message your comment to me directly or question directly. I can ask on your behalf if you prefer to remain confidential.
So I'd really like feedback. That's the hard part of webinars too. So, and again, feel free, like, we have tons of information. I put a few here. But if you want to go to our website, or again, you can email me, bhill@niwrc.org.
We have had some questions about the slides, and depending on when you joined, I've been putting presentation slides into the chat box so you can find them there. If you can't see them there, or you joined in a way where they were posted before and they're not just accessible, we will make sure and send out a follow-up with everyone who attended to the email that you provided, and we can send the presentation slides, all the other documents that our presenters have given us permission to share, and then we'll also send out a session evaluation along with that all together after that.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Comments, questions? Do they make your brain spin? Yeah. I'd also be interested in what you want to know more about or suggestions for changing this kind of presentation. Other trainings, materials you'd like.
Oh, yes, my name is Bruce Kay. I was wondering about a couple of things. I earlier put in the chat, what particular parts of the brain are affected by loss of a loved one?
Mhm.
And the other is, what is your knowledge about the concept of blood memory?
Okay, on the first one, honestly, I have no idea. I've never thought of
Okay.
that. I mean, if you're looking at loss in terms, it is a kind of trauma.
Mhm.
It kind of depends. That actually would be a question for Dr. Carol Warshaw at the National Center of Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health.
Mhm.
I have some information which I'd have to refer to because I can never remember that kind of stuff myself, that talks about how trauma impacts different parts of the brain, the hippocampus, and those kinds of things.
Mhm. Mhm.
That kind of information I could share.
Okay.
If
Okay.
you want to email me, I'll look for that, those slides, that information, and get it to you.
The reason I asked that question is because I worked for 24 years as a substance abuse counselor, prevention specialist.
Mhm,
And within the time that I worked in that field, I looked up into the research, particularly with children that are separated from their parents.
mhm,
And I find that the two parts of the brain in particular that are affected are the limbic system and the
Mhm.
frontal cortex.
mhm,
And it bears out in terms of what clinicians in particular
mhm,
are witnessing with children that have had this happen to them.
mhm,
They're highly depressed, they're anxious,
mhm,
but also the behaviors that are exhibited, you
mhm,
know, self-harm, but also outwardly causing physical damage in classroom situations,
right.
you know, breaking of windows, so forth and so on. All of those kinds of behaviors really indicate that.
Mhm,
And so what that led me to was to look into how we can work with children that are suffering severely
mhm,
in those areas.
mhm.
And later on down the road, I came upon a really powerful curriculum called the Circle of Courage. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm,
And that comes from Reconnecting Youth.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are things that really for me are very powerful. And I thank you for the presentation that you made here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, that doing the neurobiological, there's only so much my brain literally is going to absorb. What I believe in and know is, regardless of what part of the brain, there's ceremony and there's relationships, and then there's, some special techniques for grounding and that kind of thing. So the healing part is real similar, regardless.
Absolutely,
That's-
absolutely.
that's-
I wholeheartedly agree with you on that.
Yeah. So that
Because,
was,
and so that being said, for myself as a practitioner of drumming and singing, I know what it does for me personally.
mhm,
And those are the techniques that I use when I go in and work with children,
mhm,
and they respond very well to it. 'Cause
mhm,
most of them are still to this day, as adults, they're seeking that out.
mhm,
Anytime that they find that there's a opportunity for them to join drum groups, so forth and so on, that's where they go.
mhm.
And again, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for sharing that.
Brenda, I did want to note real quickly that there is a comment from Shalana Banks in the chat that says really appreciates the information and believes that there are a lot of key points that can translate to African American culture as well, and that it's important to lead with the belief that relationships are integral to healing and helping.
Mhm.
And we do have time, I believe, for one more question if before we take a brief break. Anyone would like to take that spot for that question?
Yeah, in regards to that comment, to me, Indigenous is Indigenous, and when you're really connected to what that means, that's reality. So it goes across all Indigenous peoples. Does that make sense? So that's why we can see each other, see in each other ourselves sometimes when we're on that level. Because that's just reality. It's kind of beyond culture. Anyway, anybody else? Questions or comments?
There is a request to provide your email once again. I could drop that in the chat too.
Okay, it's just B Hill, all lowercase, at niwrc.org. First initial, last name, and then the organization acronym, basically. B Hill. Anything else? Anxious for your breaks? Thanks for hanging in there with me. I enjoy doing this.
Well, Brenda, we absolutely do want to thank you so much for this, the message of cultural connection, and for many of us, reconnection and revitalization, and seeing specifically and practically, very pragmatically, what happens in our behavioral health, mental health outcomes and prevention outcomes when we do have that cultural connection and we rely on that culture as our strength and as our resilience, and those key protective factors that we find there that are so very, very, very powerful. For the group, we will take a quick break. And now, Brenda, I do want to mention too to the group in providing the email. Brenda and I had a conversation earlier that she is happy to follow up with any questions that you have that we didn't have time for in the chat. So you can certainly do that. You're also welcome. Let me put my email here in the chat as well. If there is anything that we can assist you with at NIHB or making further connections with that, please reach out to me at nihb.org and Billy at nihb.org, and I can absolutely help you make those connections. So we will take a brief break. Let's see, looking at the time right now, let's take, if everyone's comfortable, about a 10-minute break. Maybe we can come back about 5 minutes before the hour. And our final session will be with Lori Jump, the CEO of StrongHearts Native Helpline. And we will be looking forward to that presentation. So a quick break, about 10 minutes. And again, about 5 minutes before the hour, we'll come back together and continue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
before I go, like I said, I am out tomorrow connecting stuff. So Chris is coming in early tomorrow to take over the on-call first thing in the morning. And then you'll take over when you get in, just like you normally do. And then toward the end of the day tomorrow, you or I will switch over the Buchanan escalations to Chris. Get it all to me. Yeah, I have an appointment tomorrow, so I figured I'd just use PT.
And yeah, thanks for that, Nathan. And I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Lori Jump. She's a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and is a chief executive officer of the StrongHearts Native Helpline. Her love of family and community is central to the work she chooses, as her belief that we have responsibilities to those who came before us, and those who will follow. And her most important roles are those of being a mother, a grandma, sister, daughter, and auntie. Lori brings a wealth of tribal advocacy experience to StrongHearts, having worked for her tribe for over 25 years, working in the tribal, state, and federal jurisdictions. She continued her work in the field of violence against women as a founding member and former executive director of Uniting Three Fires Against Violence of Michigan's tribal coalitions. And she also continues to serve her tribal nations as a court judge for the Sault Ste. Marie Chippewa Tribal Court. And with that, I'll give it off to Lori. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, thank you. I want to make sure I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. As she said, my name is Lori Jump. I'm the CEO for StrongHearts Native Helpline. I've been doing this work forever, it seems like some days. And I always like to start out with a land acknowledgement. No matter where you're at today, you are on lands that were ancestral to one of our tribal nations. StrongHearts Native Helpline's headquarters are in the greater Minneapolis-St. Paul area, the lands of the Santee, the Sault Santee, and the Wapakute. And today we're going to talk a little bit about violence in Indian country and why we experience the violence that we do, and the importance of our history. So in general, and I'm going to kind of whip through these a little bit because I'm sure that Brenda probably touched on a lot of this. If there are questions, certainly feel free to interrupt me and ask. And if there's time, there's an exercise that I'd like to do at the end, if we have time to do that. But so in general, 574 tribal nations, right, with a unique legal relationship with the United States. While there are similarities between our tribes, especially regionally, it's important to remember that these are all distinct tribal nations with all the responsibilities and authorities of a nation. Traditionally, our women were really upheld as sacred, as life givers, was leaders in our communities with very important roles. And then we look at the statistics that we have, for violence against, especially our women and children. 83% of our women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. 97% of our women and 90% of our men experience violence at the hands of interracial partners. So somebody from outside of our, Native American, Alaska Native American groups. So as you can see, the statistics really are epidemic level in Indian country. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be. Historical trauma is, for anybody that's working in Indian country with, Native American, Alaska Native peoples, it's very important for us to understand historical trauma and the impact that it has on our people today. The reality is that it impacts 100% of us, whether we realize it or not. Trauma travels through family lines. And somebody, I jumped on at the end of Brenda's presentation and somebody talked about blood memory. That's the thought that trauma is passed down through genetics. And that's been proven with people of the Holocaust whose DNA physically changed as a result of the trauma that they experienced. And I believe that that's true for Native Americans as well, right? So historical trauma represents the cumulative wounding over the lifespan and across generations. And that's something that our people certainly have experienced. Our historical trauma is rooted in colonization. And again, it really has impacted, I believe 100% of us, and again, whether or not we realize that is something different. Colonization. When we talk about colonization, I think that people make the assumption that we're talking about, 1492 and Columbus sailing, the ocean blue. But the reality is that colonization certainly started at the moment of contact, but it's continued, and it continues even today. Our sovereignty is attacked on a regular basis. In fact, today's a very important day at the Supreme Court, where oral arguments were heard this morning on the Brackeen v. Haaland case. And this is a case that's going to have a huge impact on Indian country, in particular child welfare cases. And it's talking about whether or not the placement preferences that are laid out in the Indian Child Welfare Act are discriminatory, being based upon race. And so it's a huge case right now. And so just really hoping things went well this morning. I wasn't able to listen into the oral arguments as I had an appointment out of town. So, but as you can see by this list, there were a number of different policy eras, in the United States, and each one of them really dictated how Native Americans were treated by the U.S. government, or, mistreated, right? So many promises made, treaties, and really promises broken. And I see this slide and, it just has such an impact on me. And if you can't read it, what it says is they made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they only kept but one. They promised to take our land and they took it. And I just feel like in so many ways that really tells the story of Native American history, the history that really is not told. We get these bits and pieces, but really our history is not told. If you're interested in our history, the only way you're going to find out about it is searching it out on your own. We don't teach it in our school systems. And it really is only as an adult that I learned about it myself. Really I was about 40 before I really started to understand what our history really was. One of the eras that I like to talk about in particular, because I feel like it had one of the biggest impacts on us today, was the Indian boarding school era. And, our children were taken unwillingly from our ancestors, and they were stripped of everything, right? Their names, their hair, their clothing, their language, their family, everything that they knew was taken from them. And and they were dressed in clothing that they didn't recognize. They were given names that they didn't recognize. They were taught a language that they didn't know. They were, punished severely if they used their language, if they tried to practice their traditions, and they were stripped of all of that. And if they survived boarding schools, if they were given the opportunity to return to their communities, and let's remember that many were not given that opportunity. Many of our children died in these boarding schools. But when they went back to their community, they really no longer felt as if they belonged there, right? They no longer knew their language or their traditions. They looked different, they spoke different, they had different names, right? And so they were considered assimilated and separated from their communities. And yet at the same time, they could never be white enough to feel accepted in mainstream community either. And so we have people who really were just disenfranchised from anybody and everybody, right? And what is the impact of our historical trauma, right? Well, the impact is real. And one of the biggest ways that I think that the impact shows up today really is in our distrust of outside agencies and organizations. So many times those people that came in as helpers, and I'm using my quotations when I say that, actually caused great harm, right? When you look at things that, for instance, the Indian Child Welfare Act that I mentioned earlier, that was a legislation that was passed, I believe, in 1978. And it was passed because so many of our Native children were taken from us and were placed in non-Native homes and were adopted out away from our communities. And I want to say it was like 80% of the children who were placed in foster care were placed in non-Native homes. And it was so bad, it was so extreme that federal legislation was actually passed to stop that practice, right? And the Indian Child Welfare Act has in it placement preferences that must be followed by state agencies, right? That you have to look for a home that is Native. And so, again, the impact is real. We don't trust people. There are multiple layers of trauma. We're frustrated. We are disempowered, depression. And I think when we look at the health disparities that our people face, a lot of it can be traced back to historical trauma. And as I said, some of these things, most of us don't even know our own history, right? And so we don't understand why our families have the problems that they have. We don't understand why there's mental health issues, why there is, sexual abuse and substance abuse and all of these kind of ills that our communities face. We don't understand why that is if we don't understand our history. And so again, here we are back at this place where we have these kinds of statistics, right? And with so many people that have experienced violence, really the reason that StrongHearts exists is because, well, actually, let me go back to this, to the barrier. So on top of all of these things, right? Barriers to safety and justice that our people in Indian country face are many. And some of them are, we are all related. And that's something that I believe that most Native Americans believe in, that we feel a connection to each other. And in some ways, that's one of the best things about being Natives is that there's this huge support system out there, right? But on the other hand, it does have kind of some, pros and cons to it, right? When you're looking for assistance and the person that you have to ask for, especially in cases of domestic and sexual violence, where it's hard to talk about, it's not something you want other people to know. And then having to go in and talk to somebody who might be related to you is a barrier. It makes it harder to reach out. for assistance. Maybe, you know, the person that you have to talk to is related to your abusive partner. And again, you know, that makes it harder to reach out. And so that's something that, you know, that being related like that is has pros and cons to it. Jurisdictional issues are huge in Indian country. And I have a slide about that we'll talk about. Geographic remoteness. You know, we're not all located in cities and towns that have transportation. We don't have, you know, telephone and internet. Again, that historical distrust of local authorities, not trusting people to actually help us when they say they want to. And then a resource disparity. So many of our communities don't have the resources that we need, right? To meet the needs of our people, whether that is, you know, medical, whether it is substance abuse, mental health, whether it's food, transportation, certainly services for the survivors of domestic and sexual violence, tribal shelters, those kinds of things. They really are hard to find in Indian countries sometimes. And when I talk about jurisdiction, this is kind of a cheat sheet that law enforcement and prosecutors use to determine who has jurisdiction in a criminal case, right? So we have to look at whether or not the victim is Native American or non-Indian. We have to know whether or not the perpetrator or the abusive partner is Native American or non-Indian. We have to look at where the crime happened. You know, for some tribes have great, you know, huge amounts of land, others do not. My tribe in particular is what's called a checkerboard reservation. So we might own a piece of property here, and we own one over there, and the land in between is not reservation. So who has jurisdiction on that piece of land? Well, it's not Native Americans, right? It's not the tribe. You know, so the type of crime that's committed, it also determines jurisdiction. And so a lot of times this jurisdiction, you know, somebody is assaulted on reservation land and it appears as though nothing is happening. And sometimes what it is that they have to figure out who has jurisdiction. It likely is not the tribe. And so then we have to figure out, is it the state that has jurisdiction? Is it the federal government that has it? And then we have to contact those agencies to come in and assist with the investigation and make decisions about whether or not they're going to pick up those cases. And one of the slides that I had showed up earlier, you know, the federal government declines to prosecute 75% of sexual assault cases in Indian country. And victims are left feeling that they don't have any place to turn, right? There aren't any services. And then we don't have, you know, prosecutions are not occurring. And so it just seems like they're helpless, right? There's not a whole lot they can do about the situation that they're in. And that really is why StrongHearts Native Helpline exists. The National Domestic Violence Hotline realized that in spite of the very high rates of domestic violence that Native Americans face in our communities, very few actually reached out to the National Helpline for assistance. And they actually wanted to do something about that, right? And I can remember hearing about this project back in about 2012 or 2013 when they started asking questions and meeting with some grassroots advocates. And to be quite honest with you, I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. I didn't think much would come of it. And they were talking about having a Native helpline, and people were pretty excited. And I have to admit that I wasn't. I was like, okay, we've kind of have heard this before. I'm not going to hold my breath. And lo and behold, they followed through. And that's just kind of unusual in my experience to have a national organization actually follow through on something like that. And so they helped us establish this helpline. We launched in 2017, so we are about 5 years old. We are 24/7. You can reach us by calling or texting 1-844-7-NATIVE. And you can also chat online with us at strongheartshelpline.org. Okay, I already told you all of this. Sorry about that. We started out as we had limited operational hours, and we were like 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. And we've eventually, worked our way up over this past 5 years to become 24/7, which has been really important, I think, for our relatives. One of the things that we realized early on was that when we did have limited operational hours, we really were afraid of having somebody call us and then not get anybody on the other end of the line because of our hours. So we had it set up that just simply by pressing 1, they could be transferred to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And what we found was that less than 10% of our contacts chose to do that. And that tells us something, right? That tells us that Native American people want to reach out to Native American services. They're looking for culturally specific services. And given the opportunity, they would rather wait for those services than be transferred to another organization. And I'll tell you what, that, that's just the real. That's just the truth. That's a fact. As I said, less than 10% chose to do that. And the National Domestic Violence Hotline does fabulous work. A lot of what we do at StrongHearts is based off of their model. Our first 2 years were in Austin, Texas, based at their helpline, so that we could figure out how everything worked, right? We've never run a national helpline before. And so we needed a lot of help setting up the infrastructure and, the technology and figuring out how everything was going to work. So I really believe they do great work. They've been a fabulous support to us. Over the years. Our other partner was the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. So we had kind of 2 of the premier nonprofits doing this work as our parent organizations, to make sure that we were doing things in the right way. And so we offer culturally appropriate support and resources to actually anybody, right? Whoever calls us is going to get something, but we are specifically trained to work with American Indian and Alaska Natives. We know how hard it is for people to reach out. And so whether, whoever's on the other end of that line is going to get assistance from our advocates. So we do help anybody, regardless of race, age, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And we also take a lot of calls from people that are not necessarily impacted by domestic or sexual violence. Maybe it's something else that's happening in their community or in their life. And we always try to help in some way. Again, I know how hard it is to reach out. And the last thing that I want to do is say, oh, that's not what we do here. Call somebody else, right? No, we try to find another resource for somebody instead of just kind of letting them, hang there by themselves. Our advocates are trained with a strong understanding of our cultures, tribal sovereignty, historical trauma, and jurisdiction. I think it's super important that they understand those pieces so that when somebody comes in and they talk about, I don't understand why the police aren't doing anything in my case. We're not legal advocates. We cannot give legal advice, but we can say, well, hey, let's talk about what those issues might be, right? And talk about just the issues of jurisdiction. I can tell you when I first left my husband and moved home, I was lucky enough to get a home on our tribal reservation. I didn't know then that as an American Indian with a non-Native spouse, my tribe did not have jurisdiction, and if he abused me in that home, my tribe couldn't do anything about that. It would have to go to the federal government. I did not understand that. And so to me, it looked like, well, nothing was happening. And you know, that's really hard as a victim to think that, boy, you know, I reported this to the police and nobody's doing anything. Nobody's helping me. So I think it's really important for our advocates to understand these pieces so that they can have conversations with the people that contact us. We know at StrongHearts that as much as our advocates can do for somebody when they make that first phone call, we know that they need ongoing support. And so we make referrals to outside organizations. The first thing we did when we were first starting to form was to develop our referral database with 250 Native-centered direct services, offering that culturally appropriate support and resources. And these are programs that are in primarily in Native communities that are operated by tribal organizations. When I was talking earlier about the resource disparities, again, there are, 574 tribal nations, right? Well, across this country, we called all of the tribes, every last one of them, and had conversations with them about who was doing this work in their community. And what we ended up with was this 250 Native-centered direct services, right? So 250 for 574 tribes. So at least half of our people don't have access to these resources. When we talk about domestic violence shelters, it's even worse. Right now we have 58 tribal shelters in our database. Again, for 574 tribal nations, clearly not enough, right? There's a serious disparity. And so it can be very hard sometimes to find the services that somebody needs. Luckily, as a project that worked very closely with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, we do have access to their database as well. And we often have to depend upon mainstream programs that are outside of our programs or outside of our tribal communities for the services that our relatives need. So when we talk about, what is in our database, right? And how we determine whether or not they are Native centered, we look at whether or not they are affiliated with any tribe, whether or not they have any unique requirements to receive services. So quite often, in order to access services, you must be a citizen of that tribal nation, right? Some tribes are able to offer services to any Native American. So thinking, your tribal health centers often are IHS facilities where any Native American can be served. Whether or not they offer any cultural practices, we really believe that our traditions and cultural practices are the path forward to healing. Getting back to those, I think is the primary way to look at ending violence in our communities, is really getting back to where, all living things have respect, and that includes our women and children. Again, whether or not they offer any emergency medical services, whether or not they provide Native language services. So thinking about people that are working in Indian country, I think it's really important that, competent advocacy, people really have to have an understanding of our history to truly be an ally. That historical trauma that still impacts so many of us today and colors our experiences is very important, right? Remember, there are 574 tribal nations. We are not all the same. We're very different. That regionally, there may be a lot of similarities, but my traditions and my cultural practices are not going to be the traditions and cultural practices of somebody from another region. And we have to understand that. There are so many myths, right? There's so many stereotypes about Native Americans. We're all casino rich. We don't pay taxes. The medicines that we use are different depending upon where we're from, right? And so I think recognizing to the cultural, intergenerational, and historical trauma that have impacted our communities and our cultures is critical. Understanding that trauma is often not recognized by the person that has experienced it. We don't realize that some of the things that we say and do and the way we act and the way we experience things is based on the trauma that we've experienced. And what that does is it leads to that ongoing perpetuation of a historical trauma and passing it on through generations, right? So really researching and understanding what cultural and traditional services are available to the families that you might be working with is really important. Being able to refer them back to a program, a traditional healer, sweat lodges, and again, that's something that's common in my community. It may not be in yours. So understanding what are the cultural practices and how do you access them in the communities that you're working in is so important. And I think, so many times what we talk about when we're talking about survivors of violence, we think we know what's best for them, right? Leaving that relationship, moving, getting away from somebody. But realizing that leaving a relationship, leaving for a Native American may mean leaving your community. It may mean leaving your reservation, your rancheria, your pueblo in order to be safe. And that's huge. It's so much bigger than leaving a relationship. And so there are many reasons why people stay, and that leaving is often very much more difficult than what we than what we think about in our initial thought process. Again, avoid those overgeneralizations. Using an empowerment-based approach, whoever you're working with actually knows what's best, knows what's safest for themselves, and helping them, giving them the tools to make those decisions themselves rather than us making them for them. Again, that's part of that victim-centered approach. Understanding the trauma and the impact of trauma and how that impacts survivors. Focusing on safety planning, really talking with people about how they can keep themselves safe, even if it's just in that moment. Understanding the difference between civil and criminal remedies, really that whole jurisdictional piece is so critical to understand and to help people understand why maybe cases take longer. Maybe that's why we don't know what's happening, and knowing who to call to find out where cases are in the system. StrongHearts can help more than just the survivors that we work with on a regular basis. For instance, if you're working with somebody in a community and you're looking for services, give us a call. Our advocates are more than happy to work with other service providers to help them find the services they need for the people they're working with. We can, help, find it in a different community. Maybe you're working with somebody who's going to go and stay with a relative in another state, where you can call us and say, what services are available in this state, right? And so we can really help in more ways than I think is initially thought. You can, certainly help us out by following us on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are starting to jump into YouTube. We don't have a whole lot up there anymore, or at this point, but we are working on it. Lots of other resources out there. Obviously, NAWRC, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, is a fabulous organization with and can provide so much help. You know, NCAI, the Tribal Institute, Tribal Court Clearinghouse, tribal coalitions, the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions End Violence. There are now, I believe, 20 or 21 tribal coalitions that do great training in the communities that they serve. And that's kind of is my presentation. I don't know if there are any questions. I do have an activity that I would like to do if we have time. I don't know if the presenters can let me know if we have time for a short activity.
Hi, Lori. Yeah, so our official time ends at 5, so I believe we have a good amount of time, so.
Perfect,
Great.
perfect. So what I'm going to ask people to do, and I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, I think. Don't know how to stop sharing. Okay, did that. Oops. Okay, now I'm not sure what I did. Sorry.
I think I could do that for you. Let me try real quick, Lori, and I can help you out, I think.
Thanks, Nathan.
I believe I can.
Yeah, if you could just, I think on the bottom, yeah.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you. I mean, my technology isn't the best, right? So I'm going to do a short activity with everybody. And what I'd like you to do, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. If you could pull out a piece of paper and a pencil and just write your answers down. These are not answers that you're going to have to share with anybody. You know, that it's for your own information. And then I'm going to ask you to do some things with the answers that you write down. And so if you have your paper and pencil ready, I'm going to start asking questions. And again, just write them down. They can be real short answers. You know, it doesn't have to be anything super long. So I'm going to start with the first one. What is the main source of information that you use to know about the world around you? So for example, you know, we watch ABC or CNN to get all your news in the morning? Do you listen to the radio? Where do you get your information about the world around you? Okay, question number 2. Who is the most important person in your life? If you had to choose one person, who would that be? And for me, I have 3 sons. I'd have to say my 3 sons. I couldn't pick just one, right? So, but you know, you get the point. Just kind of write down who you're most connected to. Number 3, what social groups or communities do you belong to? What social groups or communities do you belong to? You know, do you go bowling every week? Do you, is there a beading class that you go to? Is it where you work? Is that where you get most of your social life from? Number 4, if you had to pick one thing, what would you say is the one thing you've worked hardest for in your life? What is the one thing that you've worked hardest for in your life? And just to give you an idea, there are 13 of these, 13 quick questions. Number 5, what is your greatest source of joy? What makes you happy? What is your greatest source of joy? Number 6, What has your culture taught you to value the most? What has your culture taught you to value the most? Number 7, if you have children or pets, who is the most important person in their life besides you? So if you have children or pets, besides yourself, who is the most important person in their life? Number 8, how do you support yourself financially? Are any of you the big winner from last night's drawing? Wasn't me. Yeah, how do you support yourself financially? Number 9, who are the family members or friends that you are closest to? Who are your closest family or friends? Number 10, where is the place that you call home? Where is the place that you call home? Number 11, what does your gender mean to you? What does your gender mean to you? Just 2 more to go. What makes you feel good about yourself? Number 12, what makes you feel good about yourself? And the last question, number 13, what role in your life gives your life meaning or purpose? We all play multiple roles, right? We're all mothers, brothers, sisters, aunties, co-workers. Which role gives your life meaning or purpose?
May you repeat question number 1 again? I'm sorry.
Yep, just where do you get your information for what's going on in the world?
Oh, thank you.
Yep. So I'll read them through real quick one last time. So number 1 was the main source of information. Number 2, who is the most important person in your life? Number 3, what social groups or communities do you belong to? Number 4, what is the one thing you've worked hardest for in your life? Number 5, what is your greatest source of joy? Number 6, what has your culture taught you to value the most? Number 7, if you have children or pets, who is the most important person in their life besides you? Number 8, how do you support yourself financially? Number 9, who are the family members or friends that you are closest to? And I can share this document with somebody, with the organizers to be shared out with everybody if you're interested. Number 10, where is the place that you call home? Number 11, what does your gender mean to you? Number 12, what makes you feel good about yourself? And number 13, what roles in your life give meaning or purpose? So if you take a look at your list, you've really created a picture of the most important elements in your life. all of the things that really matter to you are written down on this piece of paper. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to cross one thing off of the list. And when you cross it off, imagine that you are eliminating that thing from your life forever. If, for instance, you cross off a person, you'll never see that person again, right? Has everybody crossed everything off? Okay. So now cross off one more item. Look at that list of things that are so important to you and X one out. And poof, just like that, it's gone, right? Now that you've done that, now cross off two items. Two more items. Two more items that you have to choose from the list of things that you care about to cross off your list. Is it getting harder to cross things off as you do this? And just for good measure, let's cross off one more. Just pick one more thing, take it off the list, cross it off, it's gone. I want you to think about how you felt as you were deciding to cross things off your list. Was it difficult? If it was, why? And did anybody refuse to cross something off? Did you get to a point where you said, no, I'm not crossing off anymore? And the reason we do this activity is to have people realize what we're asking survivors to do when we ask them to leave their homes, when we ask them to leave their relationships, when we say it's not safe for you to be there, you need to go. We aren't asking them to just leave. So many times that's the question that we hear as people working in this field. Why don't they just leave? Well, it's hard. You know, sometimes it's giving up everything that you know, everything that you value, everything that you've worked for. I've known people who have had to leave their communities, who've had to move a state away to be safe. And what it meant for them was giving up a job that they loved, their entire family, right? Had to go to court to get permission to take their children with them. And so just try to remember that, you know, how you felt when you were doing this activity and crossing off. Some things are easy to leave behind, right? You know, you listen to, you know, the local TV station for your news. That's easy to leave behind. You can get the news in another way. You can look it up online, right? Can't always replace your greatest source of joy. Can't always replace the thing that makes you feel best about yourself, or the job that gives you meaning, the work that you do in your community that provides your life with meaning and purpose. Those aren't so easy to replace. And so when we ask survivors, why don't you just leave? This is what we're asking them to do. And I think it's important to think about that, right? it's not quite so simple as we would want it to be. And I see somebody did get the questions up in the list. And just for if you are interested, I think I had you cross off 1, 2, 3, 5 things. 5 of the 13 is what I asked you to cross off. So I don't know. Does anybody want to share whether or not they refuse to cross anything off? Okay. Well, that is my presentation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Lori. If we were in a room, it would be a round of applause right now. Sharing my emojis here. Yeah, if anyone wanted to share anything, remarks on what you thought, any feedback is appreciated and open on the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourselves. But Lori, would just very appreciate your time and you took today to share your knowledge, your leadership, and your words. I really appreciate it and definitely learned a lot. And I'm grateful for everyone for taking the time out of your days to attend our webinar. And we hope to continue bringing some great, amazing speakers and knowledge and resources to everyone. So I believe, Nathan, you have anything else to share?
Yeah, just very quickly, and thank you so much, Alicia. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be doing a follow-up email to everyone who attended and sending out copies of the presentations, some of the documents that our presenters have given us permission to share, as well as an evaluation for the seminar. So all of that will come together. And then hopefully very soon we'll have the recording uploaded to an NIHB web space, and we'll absolutely share out when that's available for you to see as well. So thank you all for attending. I appreciate you so much. Thank you, speakers, for this wonderful information. It's been such a great day. So I appreciate everyone and hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks, Lori.
Yep.
Thank you, Lori, for your presentation. I really appreciate that you touched up on the barriers such as cross-jurisdiction and geographical remoteness. I also appreciate that you brought up about advocacy, knowing about historical trauma, the boundaries, as well as, understanding the jurisdictions, because, federal, state, you got county, you got local, you got city, you got town. And so just bringing that up, I feel like in any advocacy is very, very important. I also love that you brought up like what to avoid and what to use. And I feel like, the safety planning is important when it comes to those that are, wanting to leave a DV or IPV relationship. However, I think it's very important that we understand trauma, the historical trauma. We also understand what their current situation is. So like all your presentation was very like trauma focused, and I think that was very important, and I do appreciate that. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.